Well, good morning, everybody. We're a little slim this morning, but we're going to get you up and go to it. Yesterday was supposed to be a day of celebration, celebrating the new year coming in, the old year behind us. But it was a sad, sad day because we lost both Bonnie Kane and Roy Cordell yesterday, and I'm sure all of you are aware of that. Roy passed away at like 2:30 a.m. yesterday. And I think Bonnie passed away around 7:30 or 7:40 last night. So just lift these families up. It just breaks my heart for both of them and what they went through. Bonnie, the last several years, battling cancer. And Roy, it seems like it was just one thing after the other all of this past year. But it just breaks my heart. We're going to miss both of them, but you just pray for those families. Just lift them up. Many others we need to remember to pray for. Bobby and Deborah Ellen just lost their home in a fire. Cheryl and I visited with them Friday. They're going to be okay. They did have insurance on their house. But they have some immediate needs, so the church is going to try to help them. Later in worship service today, we're going to ask for a love offering, and the church will give some money for them for their immediate needs until they can get resettled. So you remember them in your prayers. Continue to lift up Ray Reese. I had the opportunity to visit with him week before last, or a week or so ago. Mike was there and his brother Eddie. And I really enjoyed my time that I spent with him. He was in good spirits. He's doing as well as can be expected, I guess. And I really appreciate the care that Mike and Eddie has given him. He's very fortunate to have you guys. But I told Eddie after I left in a text message, Mike, what a testimony your dad's going to have later when he recovers. And he'll be able to share with others that have gone through something similar, how God pulled him through all of this. So, man, he's going to have a testimony. Yes. So you remember to continue to pray for him. A.C. Murphy, that's Steve Murphy's dad. Continue to remember him. And Cheryl told me this morning that Steve's mom had taken a fall this weekend. It was all beat up and bruised up, but I think she's okay, no broken bones. But man, they've been through it the last few months, so just remember that family, Steve's family. Our youth, are they already back, Brother George? Do you know how many got to go on the trip?
It was probably 15.
That's great. That's great. I hope the weather cooperated this time of year. You never know what you're going to get in Gatlinburg.
On the way up there, they had a slow trip.
Really? We're glad that they're home safely. You continue to pray for our youth and our children's area, that God will help us find a way to grow in those areas. We have so many needs in our church and our church family, but it's so special when you have needs and you know other people are praying for you. I appreciate the prayers for Cheryl. She's doing good, and just thank you for that. I'll continue to pray for our nation. Hopefully there'll be some changes this year with some change in the leadership, at least in the House. We'll see how that goes. We need to remember to pray for the people of Ukraine.
That's until next year, right?
This coming year, I hope there'll be some changes because of the changes in leadership in the House of Representatives. The Republicans have the majority now.
Right.
The Republicans have the majority in the House of Representatives, so I'm
Right, good. That's good.
Yeah, that's a good thing to me.
Well, the presidential election won't. I thought the presidential election won't happen. Won't happen until next year.
Yeah, that's 2 more years. 2 more years. So we're a long way from that.
That's supposed to be 2024.
Right. And before I forget it this morning, I want to thank Dean Pierce for filling in for me for a couple of weeks at the beginning of this month when we were away. And then we missed Sunday school these past 2 weeks. So we may be here for a while this morning, George. I don't know if you're going to get to preach today or not. I may get wound up here and having to cover 2 or 3 weeks of lessons. But we're glad that you're here. I'm going to ask Donald to lead us in a word of prayer and we'll get started.
Father, our hearts are kind of broken today because of the passing away of 2 of our precious members thank you for our holiday, especially my home, and I know others that are here that had family at home. Lord, again, I thank you for everything. I thank you for Donnie, for Cheryl. He's taking care of her in a very good manner. Father, thank you for his teaching. Father, I just thank you for all the good things in life. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. These past several weeks, our lessons have been focused on putting fear in its place. Putting fear in its place. You know, fear is something that is real, and there are certain things that we have fears about. Cheryl has fears of snakes. Real bad. Real bad. But fear is something that is real. And how do we overcome those fears? That's what the lessons have been focused on these past several weeks. The first lesson we had in this series was talking about the fear of God. But when we talk about the fear of God, I think about the reverence that we have for God. We need to have an awareness that He is sovereign, that He is in control. No matter how smart, how intelligent we think we are, or mankind is, or science is, God is sovereign and He is in control. And what an awesome God that we serve. So that fear is really reverence for God and recognizing who He is. We talked about the security that we have when we become believers. Nothing can take me out of the hand of God. And the only thing that can separate me from the love of God, Brother George, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my own personal sin. Is the only thing that separates me from the love of God. But once I'm saved, I'm saved. So we have security in our relationship with our God. You know, God's love, one of the lessons 2 weeks ago talked about God's love. How do we put fear in its place? By being aware of God's love. There's no place for fear, really, when we allow God to replace that fear with His presence in our lives. It gives us assurance. It gives us confidence. It gives us the knowledge of knowing that God knows every detail about my personal life. And yes, storms are going to come. Difficulties are going to come. Jesus said that clearly over in the Gospel of John. So we're not exempt from those storms and those trials, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. Last week's lesson was talking about submission to God. If we genuinely submit ourselves to His will, and if we live in obedience to the way He's called us and commanded us to do, then He is the answer for our fear. Today's lesson is talking about courage in place of fear. How do we have courage in place of fear? The writer here says, courageously follow Jesus even in fearful circumstances. Well, how do we do that? You know, we can't always control our circumstances, but we can control how we respond to those circumstances. You know, we face many different kinds of situations that can be unnerving, really. And those situations tempt us to be afraid. So the key to responding properly in those moments, it has to do with what our focus is, what we're focused on. Christ is with us in everything that we encounter, and so we do well to keep our eyes on Him. And we're going to see in the lesson today how the disciples, even in that storm out on that ship, recognized Jesus on the water because they were actually expecting Him and they were looking for Him. That's how they were able to manage with the situation that they had. But a Christ-centered focus may not change the situation. We may still have to go through that trial because God may have determined that we needed to go through that trial. But it does dissipate the fear in our hearts. You know, we're looking at Matthew chapter 14 today. I hope you turn there in your Bible. We're going to look at just a few passages beginning with verse 22. But if you look at the events leading up to this time frame that we're talking about where Jesus walks on the water, if you look back into chapter 13, I want to say it is, Then we see where Jesus had been, we're in 14, it's back in 13, where Jesus had been rejected in his own hometown of Nazareth. He taught in his synagogue, and people were saying things like, well, isn't that Jesus, the son of Joseph, the carpenter? And they named his brothers, and they even named his sisters. We know who he is, and he's going to come in here and talk like this, like he's got this kind of authority and knowledge. I mean, where did he get all this? We know this guy. And so they rejected him. And then Jesus had just heard about the death of his friend John the Baptist by the hands of Herod, the king. He had been beheaded. And then also in chapter, I'm getting my own chapters messed up here. I said we're in chapter 14. In this chapter 14, Jesus had just fed the multitude. It says Jesus fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Actually, it was 5,000 men. That's not even counting the women and the children. Miraculously. But after all these events that had just happened, Jesus needed some time to himself, to reflect, to restore his energy. He wanted that big crowd that had gathered after all of these events had taken place to just go away. You know, he just needed some time alone for a little while. So he instructed his disciples, I hope I don't start doing that. He instructed his disciples to go get on the boat and go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. I want to say that they were in the area of Bethsaida when this event happened, where he fed these several thousand people, and where he instructed them to go across the Sea of Galilee was toward Capernaum. The Sea of Galilee was really a freshwater lake, Brother Donald. It wasn't that big. It was only, it's my understanding, 8 miles wide and 13 miles long. So it wouldn't have taken, even in that time, by a boat that was powered by a sail, it wouldn't have taken that long to get to one side of the lake to the other. But a ferocious storm came when the disciples were on the water. Jesus had stayed behind in that area of Bethsaida. He needed a little bit of time on his own. So that's kind of where we pick up with today's lesson. I just wanted to bring you up to that point. Excuse me. So if you're with me in Matthew chapter 14, beginning with verse 22. The scripture says, and straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship and to go before him unto the other side while he sent the multitudes away. One of the reasons Jesus wanted to send the multitudes away, they were ready after witnessing all these miracles that he did. They thought he was the Messiah, which indeed he was the Messiah, but they wanted to make him a king. Now, had the disciples stayed, I think it's easy for me and you to figure out how the disciples would have felt. They would have probably gone along with that because they didn't fully understand yet Jesus' mission, that he was sent directly by God. And it was not his role to become the king of the Jews. So that's what was happening as we began reading these verses. So Jesus was urgent in his message to the disciples, I want you to get on the boat right now and head over to the other side. And I'm going to disperse this crowd, and I'm going to take a little time by myself to reflect and to pray to my God. And so that's what they did. And it says, and when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up into a mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, he was there alone. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, and it was being tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary or against it. And in the 4th watch of the night, they had watches every 3 hours. The 4th watch would have been between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning, that next morning. It says that in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. Walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, it is a spirit. And they cried out for fear. So I'm probably going to have a glass of water or something, or a bottle of water. I don't know. know where we're going to get that. Excuse me. We're not going to let the devil keep me from finishing this, so we're going to finish. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a spirit," and they cried out for fear. And straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid." And then Peter, the impulsive one, as we know, he answered him and he said, "Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water." Can you believe Peter would do that? I can. He was just that sort of guy. He was impulsive. He was the one that wanted to always jump out there in front, and sometimes without even reflecting on what he was doing or thinking about it. It reminds me of somebody I know, don't it, you, Cheryl? And Jesus said, "Come." He told Peter to come. Come on out here, big boy. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he actually walked on the water to go to Jesus. Think about that just for a minute. Can you picture that? You know, a lot of people criticize Peter for what we're fixing to read next. But I got to give Peter a lot of credit for his faith in believing, because Jesus told him to come, that he could actually walk on water. That he could actually walk on water. But when Peter saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and he began to sink, and he cried, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand, and he caught him, and he said unto him, "O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt?" You know, Jesus seems to chide Peter here for his lack of faith. But again, before we criticize Peter too, I got to recognize his strong faith for thinking that he could actually walk on water. And he did just for a moment, until he allowed that fear to come in and recognize the situation that he was in. And then he was so afraid, I mean, he was going down. He was going down. But isn't that the way it kind of is sometimes when fear envelops us? Unexpected, and something comes into our life, not only uninvited, but in an invasive way, and so sudden that we're just consumed with fear, and we're not sure how to react. Can anybody relate to that or share a circumstance that you may have gone through that caused you to feel that way? I think all of us have experienced that at some time or another in our lifetime. It's pretty scary, isn't it, when you don't know how to react initially, and you're just kind of frozen with fear. That's happened to me before, and I bet you that's happened to you before. So I can kind of feel where Peter was. But again, I got to give him credit. He stepped out there in faith. And when they were coming to the ship, the wind ceased. And then they were in the ship. They came and they worshiped him, saying, "Of a truth, thou art the Son of God." Now, I got some really good stuff I want to share with you this morning related to this story from my Warren Wiersbe commentary, and I think some of it is beautiful. I've already mentioned the fact that Jesus was concerned about staying with that multitude of people because they wanted to make him a king. That was not what God sent him for. He needed some time to refresh himself and to pray and get that connection again directly with God. But boy, was his disciples, they were in a frightening situation, but they ended up being blessed. You know, this experience of the disciples in the storm, it can be an encouragement to us too when we go through storms of life. If we think about what we've just read, we find ourselves in the storm. There are several assurances that we can rest on that God's going to do for us if we're genuine believers. First of all, we need to recognize that he's the one that brought us there. He's the one that allowed that storm to come into our lives. We can't say that this is something that the devil did. God allowed this to come into our life. But there's two kinds of trouble, if you will, two kinds of storms. There are two kinds of storms. There's storms of correction. That's when God disciplines us. That's when we've been disobedient. And when I think about that, the first one that comes to my mind in the Bible is Jonah. What he went through because of his disobedience. So that is a storm of correction. But then there's also storms of perfection. These are times when God brings these storms in our lives to help us grow. If you think for a moment, if you were one of those disciples that was in that boat and you just experienced a picture that's drawn for us by reading the scripture from Matthew chapter 14, and you see Jesus walking on the water, and then he comes into the boat, and as soon as he comes into the boat, the storm just dissipates. It's gone. It's calm. Do you think they ever forgot that moment for the rest of their lives? No. That was one of those, I know when we're growing up, our grandchildren, we call certain things, I like to call them core memories. And I'll tell my grandchildren, now this is something that you need to know, and it's probably something that Cheryl or my grandchildren, my daughter, don't want them to hear. But I'll say, now girls, this is a core memory. You need to get this. A core memory is something that we don't forget. It's something that we don't forget. And I can't see those disciples forgetting that picture forever. But many Christians have mistaken the idea that obedience to God will produce smooth sailing. In other words, we don't have to go through these things. But if you look at what Jesus said in the Gospel of John, chapter 16 and verse 33, he assured us that we were going to have tribulations. Jesus said that himself, that me and you are going to have tribulations. There are going to be storms in our life that we're going to have to go through. But you know what? Not only did he bring that storm, we need to recognize that he is praying for me. I said earlier in the introduction that Jesus knows every detail about our personal life. We talk about praying for one another, but we don't think about a heavenly Jesus sitting on the right hand of God making supplication for you and I. He's praying for me and you in it, Brother George. Is that precious? He's praying for me and you. So whatever the storm is, if we recognize that he's praying for us, it helps eliminate that fear. We're not frozen anymore because we know God is present and he is with us, no matter how difficult things might get. We should recognize that Jesus will come to us. Just as he came to those disciples and walked on the water and came to that boat, he will come to us. You know, sometimes in those moments of crisis, those times to when we feel like we're afraid, we may think for a moment that Jesus has deserted us, but he never deserts his own. If you're a believer, Jesus never deserts you. When we are going through the hard times of life, he is there. He is aware. He is present. And he always comes to us in the storms of life. Why did Jesus walk on the water? Maybe it was to show those disciples that the very thing they feared the most, the sea, it was only a staircase for him to come to them. That was a means for him to come to them. So a totally different perspective from what they may have had before. So it was an opportunity for them to grow spiritually in their faith and understanding of who Jesus was. Why did they recognize Jesus? Because they were actually looking for him. He told them that he was going to come. So they were actually looking for him. Otherwise, they would not have recognized that it was Jesus walking on the water. He will help me grow. That was the whole purpose of the storm in the story that we just read. After all, Jesus would one day leave them, and they would face many storms in their ministries. So they had to learn to trust him. They had to learn to trust him and know and understand and have that confidence that he is always with them. He is always present. Even though he may not be physically present, he is with us every moment. The writer here says, well, what caused Peter to sink? Well, his faith began to waver because he took his eyes off the Lord and he began to look at the circumstances around him. Isn't that true in life in general? We sink because we take our eyes off of Jesus. We let those circumstances burden us to the point, and we get that sense of fear and not having that confidence of what I'm going to do, instead of simply trusting and thinking, well, I know Jesus knows this. I'm not sure why he allowed this to come into my life, but I know he's got it, and I know he's got me, and I know I'm going to be okay. He already knows the outcome. I don't know the outcome, but he already knows the outcome, and I'm going to trust him that the outcome is going to be good. And again, it may not take me out of my immediate circumstance, but boy, just that peace that we have of knowing that Jesus is present, that he's aware, that, hey, he's going to take care of me. He's got this. He's got this. I better hush. I'm going to get into George this time. I'm going to go over to the end of my lesson and read a few sentences from the writer here in my Herschel Hobbs commentary. The lesson we had today was the fifth lesson out of these. I think we got one more next week to conclude the study about talking about fear and how do we deal with it. But in each one of these lessons, we've acknowledged some things that are to be feared, and that at times we're going to be afraid. I mean, that's just the general makeup of who we are as human beings. It's part of our emotional makeup. Fear is real. But as we saw in Peter, even some who follow Jesus can be afraid. So what do we do when those fearful situations arise? The kind of things that we talked about that we can't change, we can't control. We take our focus off of what generates the fear, and we stay focused on Jesus. Now that sounds simple, doesn't it? It sounds simple. That's not always easy to do, but that's what we must do as believers. That's not to say that we ignore our fears, acting as if the situation doesn't exist. That's simply foolish to handle it in that manner. But it is to say that we believe Jesus is greater than our fears. Now that's faith. That's real faith. Therefore, we press forward with courage, not because we are strong, but because we know he is reaching out. He's holding us secure. And in those moments, we can marvel at him and we can declare, truly, you are the Son of God. Wow. The writer puts it a lot better than I can, and that's the way we'll sum it up this morning. And I'm ending right on time, Brother George. So you got a full show there. It's 9:30. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your faithfulness.
One comment
Yeah.
about all this, and I agree 100% that the lesson is there if we take our focus on Jesus and start looking at circumstances, we're going to fail and fall. But, and I've preached that message, heard it 1,000 times, but recently I was just studying this passage and it occurred to me. Now, they were already in the midst of the storm. The Bible said the wind was contrary, so that tells me they were going into the wind, into the waves. They were all seasoned, most of them sailors.
Right, fishermen.
All that, been on the water. Now, what would you do if you're in that situation? If you're trying to go here, but the wind was blowing, most of us would turn around and gone back with the wind.
Right.
Because you know, if you've been on the water, you don't go into the headwind. You turn around and let it take you and try to get there. So to me, they exercised a lot of faith before Peter's failed, because they knew that Jesus had told them, "I'll meet you on the other side," and so
They were determined.
obedient and doing what Jesus said, even though their instincts would have told them, "I need to turn this boat around,
Right.
and get out of this." So it's easy to throw Peter on the bus, but think about where they were going. It's exactly where Jesus told them to go,
Yeah.
even though the circumstances were terrible.
Right.
So anyway, I just,
And I've always, Peter wasn't a weenie. I'll say it that way. But I think about his courage just to step out there and do it just because Jesus confirmed it for him when Jesus says, come.
and I wondered if Jesus was talking to the rest of them on the boat. Why didn't y'all have the faith to jump out here and come?
Exactly.
Oh, you have a little faith.
Right.
He could have been talking to all of them.
Right.
It says about 4,000. Is that about dark?
It's what?
I don't know if it's dark or it's about dark.
Yeah, it's a time period that was, it could have been getting dark, absolutely.
Now, if all those disciples walked on water, maybe we could walk on water today. I don't
He
know.
was walking on water at that time. He would be walking this.
Oh, yeah.
And I can see why he took his mind off.
Oh, yeah?
It's hard enough for me to stay in the boat.
Yeah.
Hold on to it.
Yeah. Yeah, he was in disbelief too after he got out there and he was actually walking out there.
Last time I went fishing in the Gulf down there, I said, I'll never go back.
Yeah.
Because, it was so bad. We didn't do any fishing. I did hanging on. There was like 4 of us in that boat, and my fingerprints are probably still in the dark handholds were there. It was so bad we couldn't even fish in the bay.
Yeah.
The bay was that bad, and I said, let's get out of here.
Yeah, I've got caught in those situations before where it's really bad and you're really scared because you can't even hardly see your way to a bank or somewhere of safety. It's lightning, it's the wind is blowing, so it can be scary. Thank y'all.